The term pimp slap is a testament to our knowledge that pimps beat the women they force and coerce to work for them. But violence is just one of a pimp's tools, and it's not even his most devastating one. Pimps are master manipulators who use psychology to bind their victims in invisible chains and control them. Pimping is psychological warfare. It's not physical combat, writes Pimpin' Ken Ivey, a Milwaukee pimp, in Pimpology, The 48 Rules of the Game, an astoundingly explicit book about how pimps think. Most hoes have low self-esteem for a reason. A pimp looks for that weakness, and if it isn't on the surface, he brings that motherfucker out of them. It doesn't matter to a pimp what a hoe's weaknesses are, so long as they have them. Then he uses those weaknesses to his advantage. Yes, some pimps kidnap their victims and force them into prostitution through brutal, gut-wrenching violence, and you'll see that in this story. But you'll also see pimps deftly prey on women's emotions and past traumas, influencing them so subtly that they'll think it was their idea to sell themselves all along. I'm not going to argue that there aren't some prostitutes out there who freely choose this lifestyle. That question always comes up whenever prostitution is discussed. That happens, and there is a vocal group of self-proclaimed sex workers who speak proudly about their profession. Evidence gathered by academic researchers and by law enforcement officers on the street, however, strongly suggest that this is a niche perspective, that overwhelmingly most prostitutes are victims of at least horrible life circumstances, but more likely also the manipulation of a trafficker, whose cruel intentions we sanitize under the word pimp. Now's probably a good time to discuss the terms we'll use in this book. Throughout, I'll use the word pimp and sex trafficker interchangeably because when you drill down deep enough, you'll see that they are synonyms. In American jurisprudence, pimps generally face two possible charges: pandering or sex trafficking. They are essentially the same crime, soliciting customers for a prostitute and/or luring a woman into prostitution, with one critical difference. Pandering is silent on the pimp's violence and manipulations. Sex trafficking, on the other hand, proves that the pimp used force, fraud, or coercion to lure a woman into what's commonly known as the life or the game. Many anti-trafficking advocates say they prefer the term prostituted person instead of prostitute because it captures the extreme imbalance of power in the dynamic with a pimp. If the distinction between pandering and sex trafficking seems subtle or even strange, that's because it is. Pandering was illegal long before the concept of sex trafficking was accepted, before we as a society acknowledged that prostitutes could be victims. Sex trafficking did not become a criminal charge in Nevada until July 1st, 2013. But as Pimpin' Ken Ivey makes abundantly clear, force, fraud, and coercion are fundamental to a pimp's playbook. Pimps regularly convince women to work as prostitutes by selling them empty promises, like that once they earn a certain amount of money, they can retire. But no matter how much a prostitute makes, she's typically never allowed to stop. That's fraud. Pimps also frequently blackmail women into continuing to prostitute by threatening to tell their families what they had previously been doing voluntarily. That's coercion. With sex trafficking laws now on the books, prosecutors try to find a way to charge a pimp with sex trafficking, which typically carries much harsher penalties than pandering. So pimps are sex traffickers. Don't let the widespread acceptance of the word or their presence in music videos or at award shows fool you. Pimps are cold-blooded slave masters, men as cruel and evil as Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein. Speaking of victims, I'll use the term victim and survivor interchangeably when describing women who have been sex trafficked. This may be a bit of a controversial decision in the anti-trafficking community, but let me explain my reasoning. Many women who were sex trafficked prefer to be described as survivors rather than victims because they don't want the stigma of victimization. For them, the term survivor proudly proclaims that they made it through their trafficking experience whole and intact. I absolutely respect that line of thinking. But as I'll show time and again throughout this book, women who have been sex trafficked are routinely disregarded by the people and institutions that should help them. I think it's important to continue using the word victim when describing women who have been sex trafficked because there are still wide swaths of the population who see them as worthy only of scorn. We celebrate survivors, and we should celebrate every woman who gets out of the life. But we also need to recognize that these